Hello everyone, and welcome back to Minecraft on the Vortex server. First things first, I know I said I was gonna make a more interesting episode, but I can't really do that. I don't have anything interesting to do at the moment. Let me just bring F3 up. So it's just the nature of this game that, at least the way I'm playing it, sometimes you spend a lot of time working on projects and there's not much to show. So I'm guessing this is not much of an LP. It really never has been. It's more of a, I don't know, more of a diary kind of thing where the interesting episodes are basically where I can show progress. Anyway, if you were to go back and watch episode 46 of this series, that's the one where I was building at spawn, building a new plot because I needed a tree farm, basically. And in the comments, someone has basically written about his views on, well, on the matters I discussed. I was talking about, don't really want that. I seem to have a diamond ore for some reason. But I was talking about the origins of life and such, and basically he made an argument for creationism, stating that evolution really couldn't happen. Now, that in itself is just a belief, like, it's basically an opinion. So I'm not stating that that's a wrong opinion to have. But the arguments he made were faulty, and if you're going to argue science to make a point, then you have to use correct science, and if you're using wrong science, then it's okay to point that out. So I've already done that in the comments, but it's a lot easier on video. But firstly, there was another thing which I mentioned. So Devil Hunter, who I basically I was answering to one of his videos in that particular episode, basically, and in that he said something about life on Earth coming from a meteorite, and I found that a little bit of a silly notion, which is partly because I was not really, well, I hadn't really checked up on that theory very much, and secondly because he did phrase it quite poorly. So while it is entirely possible that life did indeed form on this planet, there's no reason it would have to be that way, basically. We know now that there are simple organisms which could easily survive flying on a meteorite through space for a relatively short amount of time. So perhaps not years, but weeks, months, easily. Now we know these creatures, and they have been put into a vacuum for months, and they've survived, and they've been frozen to almost absolute zero, and they've survived. So that's not something that people made up. I think they're called bear bugs. I will try and link to the wiki page about them in the description. But they are very sturdy little creatures, basically. So and one theory about where life could have come from is that it might have formed on a different planet in our solar system. It's unlikely that anything could have survived coming from outside the solar system, because you were talking much greater distances and thus much longer time periods in absolute vacuum and very cold temperatures. So that might not be, rather, that's very unlikely. But we do know that some asteroids that have hit Earth and might still occasionally be hitting Earth are actually from Mars. So something hits Mars and debris comes flying off, and that might well fly to Earth. And it is entirely imaginable that a simple organism could have existed in one of these asteroids. Something very tiny, but that could have withstood those forces on that asteroid, and they could have survived. So, well, it sounds a bit silly at first. It's actually a theory that might be correct. Again, this is a theory in the weaker sense of the word, which is what I'm going to talk about next. Because a lot of the confusion about this whole theory of evolution thing comes from definitions of the word. So people hear theory and they think that means it's uncertain. So for that I've pulled up the definition of theory, and there's multiple ones. So the first one, which is the one scientists use, is a coherent group of tested general propositions commonly regarded as correct that can be used as principles of explanation and prediction for a class of phenomena. For example, Einstein's theory of relativity. And synonyms for that meaning are principle, law, and doctrine. And that is the sense in which scientists use the word theory. And a lot of people who argue against the theory of evolution, they're using a different definition, which is the second one, which I'll read out now, because other people use theory, which is more of the, I don't know, everyday usage of the word, I guess, to mean a proposed explanation whose status is still conjectural and subject to experimentation, in contrast to well-established propositions that are regarded as reporting matters of actual fact. Synonyms in this case are idea, notion, hypothesis, postulate. So, that's kind of the everyday usage of the word, basically. So, I have a theory about, I don't know, I've got a theory about how this might work. I've got a theory about why he's acting the way he is, something like that. But as I said, scientists don't use it that way. So they use the first one. So the only difference, in effect, between a scientific theory and a scientific law is basically how it can be described. In general, a scientific law is more of a number-based thing, so it's usually working with formulas. It can be stated more rigorously. And a scientific theory is more a collection of ideas about how something works, not as much a clear set of equations or something like that. So perhaps if some of the confusion about the topic came from that, that should be cleared up now. I'll try to link, if I remember, I'll link to those definitions in the description as well. But basically, the word theory in theory of evolution does not imply that it's uncertain. There's evidence for it on the same kind of scale as there's evidence for the theory of relativity and gravitational laws and such things. And now thirdly, again, I will link to this in the description, is kind of a little bit of an explanation about this whole the whole problem about saying evolution violates thermodynamics. So people hear there's a second law of thermodynamics, which is a law, and evolution is a theory, so obviously the law has to take precedence, and thus if the law says the theory is wrong, that has to be true, which it's not. Firstly, an argument you can make is that a lot of scientists have worked on all of these theories and laws. They've spent a lot of time on them. And none of them have seen anything wrong with these two. None of them have seen those as contradictory. And if any of them had seen it as contradictory and had good arguments for it, then he would have published that easily. And he would have gotten quite a lot of money and quite a lot of recognition for it, because it's in a way how science works. If you prove something that's established science wrong, that makes you famous and tends to make you rich. So if you could prove that evolution was actually untrue, that it didn't happen, you could very well be in the race for a Nobel Prize. So scientists would not ignore this contradiction just because it's inconvenient. That's not how science works. Inconvenience is just not a factor that plays into it at all. Getting a lot of cobble from this so far. Terrible. So I'm just gonna have to gather my thoughts for a moment. So yeah, the common misinterpretation really is that people who use this argument state that the second law of thermodynamics states that any system has to go from being more orderly to less orderly. So any system will have to become more chaotic. And so any complicated organism could not possibly exist because it would basically be order created from chaos. Now firstly, that would technically make any form of life impossible, because life is more complicated than just random matter. So basically they're arguing that life could not have come into existence at all, and to get around that they just say that someone created it all. Which is sadly a thing that you find with a lot of these statements. They're stating none of this could have happened, except for I'm saying it could have, and that's God, or some other creator. Which is a bit self-serving and not really a good way to do this. But regardless, there's a lot of problems with this. Firstly, the original statement does not even involve entropy at all. Well, it does involve entropy, it doesn't involve like order and chaos. Again, I'll try to link to all these things in the description, because I think it's important to get this right. There's nothing wrong with arguing against life randomly coming about, and there is something wrong with arguing against evolution, because that's basically calling all the scientists, all the biologists ever who worked on this idiots and liars, which is not a good thing to do. But saying that something had to create life in the first place, that's a valid thing to say. So you can argue for those points, but argue correctly, don't use bad science, basically. But anyway, what it boils down to is a misinterpretation of what the law says and what it means. Entropy in itself is not defined as how chaotic a system is. I'll have to look where it is. Entropy. Okay. So entropy, or rather increase in entropy, is defined as heat absorbed by a system divided by the absolute temperature of the system at the time the heat is absorbed. So not talking about chaos here. For most users, it's okay to think about entropy in terms of chaos. So the more entropy something has, the more chaotic it is. But this is strictly on like a small level. So, for example, you can't argue that your room is untidy because of entropy. It doesn't quite work that way. And one thing to note, of course, is that for everyday use, yes, you can say entropy is pretty much how chaotic something is, but if you're going to go into the details of this whole thing and try to use the second law of thermodynamics to really argue a point, you should try and get these things absolutely correct, because otherwise your argument falls down. Breaks down, sorry. So try and make sure you get those terms correct, because it's not quite just a matter of, okay, so entropy is basically chaos, so because we've got chaos at first and then order, that can't work. It's a little bit simplistic to think about it that way, so... Oh, that was smart. I keep doing that when I'm like digging tunnels. So yeah. And the second law of thermodynamics basically states that any closed system will tend to go towards a certain maximum equilibrium point, a maximum entropy, which you could, again, using the slightly simplified chaos and order terms, mean that any closed system will always go from more ordered to less ordered. And in general, that's true. but you cannot use that to argue about any system. It's only closed systems. And within the system, it doesn't state that any single part of that system will always go from less chaotic to more chaotic. Simple example. If you take air. Air is basically more chaotic, and basically air has more entropy the warmer it is. Why? Because the warmer it is, the faster the molecules move in the air. The oxygen, O2, oxygen, and what's else? Nitrogen, all the other gases, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, all those stuff. All the gases in the air. The warmer it is, the faster they're moving. And obviously, if you think about it, the faster they're moving, the more chaotic it is. So in that sense, you can use chaos to illustrate the point. And I went too far. I'm building all these tunnels to exactly the same length. There we are. So if you were to say that the second law applies to all systems, then it would be impossible to ever cool down anything. Because the cooler something is, the less the molecules inside that structure move. And so the less chaotic it is, the less entropy it has. So anything that cools down loses entropy. That's a fact. That's just strictly from the definition. So if you're arguing that nothing could ever decrease in entropy, you're arguing that nothing could ever cool down. So for example, your fridge, if that second law were correct, if you brought water to the boiler, if you cook something hot, it would stay hot forever, indefinitely, always. And that's obviously not true. Which is again the closed system thing. If you put something in the fridge that's warm, it's not a closed system because it can give off heat to the outside. The point about this whole second law is that as the thing that cools down loses entropy, the thing that's warmed up around it will gain more entropy. Because entropy is basically, in the definition of entropy, you're dividing by absolute temperature. So basically the warmer something is, the less it's going to lose from cooling down, in a way. So basically, if you put something warm in the fridge, it's warm, and thus losing a bit of heat is going to decrease entropy, but not by as much as the surrounding environment gains by being heated up. Which means that in itself is not a violation of that law at all, and things can obviously cool down. I mean, sometimes in the summer we have warm days, and sometimes in winter we have cold days. So obviously things can warm up and things can cool down. And the whole point is that overall, if you consider the entire closed system, then yes, that would in general become more entropic, more chaotic, warmer. But for a single bit of that system, it does not have to be true, basically. In a way, you could argue that's what the second law states, that if entropy decreases at any point, it has to increase by more elsewhere. And that is correct. But the whole point is that locally entropy can obviously decrease, as I just said, because things can cool down. So order spontaneously arising from chaos is very possible as long as somewhere else something else is getting more chaotic. And technically the entire thing only applies to spontaneous processes and irreversible processes. In a way, if you think about it, if you put water in a freezer, it's going to freeze, which is a spontaneous change in that particular environment, because water in the freezer is not going to melt again once it's ice. But you should also note that this is relevant. It's relevant to state that the environment is important. It can't change, because if you take that ice out of the freezer, it is going to melt. And if you put a cube of ice at room temperature in your glass, it's eventually going to melt. And it's not going to turn into ice again, unless you put it back in the freezer. So the environment is important here. And it is very important, if you're arguing these points, to note that you have to talk about closed systems. And you can say this is a largely closed system, or we can approximate it by a closed system. It has to be an entirely closed system, which our planet is not. Now, the entire universe might be a closed system. Scientists are not so certain about that, because the universe is ever expanding. For example, the maximum entropy of the universe might be growing all the time, so instead of like a regular closed system where it's tending towards an equilibrium point, the entropy of the universe might not be limited and might grow forever. But that's not really the point. But yeah, as I said, if I dig down here, there's going to be something, and I don't care too much for coal. But yeah, important to note, closed systems. And then these people are stating, or rather the person in the comments was stating, that organized or more complicated life could not have formed that way. Now, if you're arguing that that law always exists, then neither could a creator have created life more complicated than that. But regardless of that, it doesn't have that much to do with evolution. In a way, it has to also do with probability. So evolution, what theory of evolution basically states, it's not so much concerning itself with how life initially started. It's just not what it's talking about. The theory of evolution says life at some point began. Some self-replicating bit of protein, DNA, something simpler than DNA, something self-replicating. We don't know what exactly it was. We just know that it was, basically. And then what it's saying is that as these things were self-replicating, they did not create perfect copies of itself. That's mutation, random mutations. So people aren't saying that that evolution has a goal, it's not working towards something, it's random. Things just change, basically. You could think about it as like a flaw in the self-reproduction system. DNA copies itself, but not perfectly. And most of these changes are chaotic, so they basically they will make the organism more chaotic and less ordered and less complex. And in a closed system, that would basically mean that things would become more chaotic over time. But there is no closed system, because there's natural selection working. Which means that these random changes, the more complex ones tend to be better. Now they're rarer, so that's the probability thing. It's more likely that one of those random changes will be chaotic and negative. There's just way more ways for things to go wrong, basically, than there are for things to go right. But if it goes wrong, that's usually bad, so the organism doesn't have an advantage from that. And that's what natural selection basically kicks in. So yes, the organism was more chaotic, so that would, in terms of entropy, be better for the system. Well, the system would tend to go towards these, it would trend towards these. But because it's like a localized thing somewhere else, something more complicated might arise. It's just rarer, basically. But because natural selection is at work, the more complicated organism might be better suited for survival. And so even a tiny little advantage, tiny increase in survivability, means that that organism is more likely to reproduce more often. And so that slight genetic change is more likely to be advantageous and to preserve itself. And that's all the theory says. And as you can see with what I've said before, it does not violate the second law of thermodynamics at all. It doesn't even apply. It just doesn't work that way. So if there's still any questions about that, I know most of you will be aware of this, or at least they won't question those points. But final word, I guess, it's okay to question established science, but there's a point where it stops being reasonable to question established science. So a lot of scientists have worked on these laws and theories for a very long time. And at first they had the duty to provide evidence for their claims. So when Darwin came up with the theory of evolution, he had to provide evidence, and he did. He found those finches on the Galapagos Islands and all that kind of stuff. He provided sound evidence that indeed his theory was correct. But at some point, when more and more evidence for a theory comes up, if you're arguing against it, it's now your turn. You can't just say I don't believe that, and scientists have to prove it more. If you now go about stating that the theory or the laws of gravity don't hold, or relativity is wrong, it's no longer scientists who have to keep proving it. It's now you who has to find flaws in their arguments. So if you still think that the second law does contradict evolution, you have to go and look at the evidence for example, for the second law of thermodynamics, and how people found out about it, and how they are arguing for it, and you're going to have to find flaws in those arguments. It's no longer a matter of saying, oh, but I don't believe that, and that's my opinion, and that's valid. If it's your opinion, yes, but if you're telling others that's true, and you're telling others that those laws contradict, then no, you have to provide evidence for that statement. Otherwise, you're doing bad science. And if you can find a logical conclusion as to why those two scientific truths cannot coexist, if there's a contradiction there, if you've got solid evidence for that, or you believe you have, you should go to a physics professor. Most physics professors I know, they would either explain the flaw in your argument, or if they found your argument to be correct, they would pursue that. Because that's what science is all about, proving yourself wrong. It's, in a way, the great thing about science. It's not about trying to be right. It's in a way, you make up a theory, and then what you do is you try to prove it wrong. And if you succeed, that theory was wrong, and you have to come up with a better one. And if a lot of people fail in proving you wrong, then you're probably right. It's just how science works. But yeah, regardless, I do hope that cleared up the issues. I know I've been talking for a long time, so I will make this all one episode, one boring episode, I guess. But yeah, just keep it in mind, and I'll probably be back in a moment with a more regular episode, so I'll see you then. Bye bye!